Okay, so I should probably introduce myself. So my name is Shanon, and I'm the unofficial president of Amara's unofficial fan club, where membership is always free. And honestly, if I were to ask you right now, actually just do me a favor, raise your hand if after seeing that you would want to join the unofficial fan club. Right? See, it's totally a thing. It's totally a thing. And seeing your hands up in the air, even though it's a little bit hard with the spotlight, tells me one thing. It tells me that we're family, and that makes this really big ballroom our living room, which, believe me, makes standing here in front of you a whole lot easier. Because today I want to take you to a hard place, and I want to tell you what it's like to be a foster child, and to share with you what happens before the happy ending. Because, as you know, especially if you've seen any Disney movie, the ending is happy because the beginning and oftentimes the middle aren't. And my hope is that by sharing my story with you today, you'll know that when you open your heart to a child in foster care, it matters. It matters more than you'll ever know. I don't know if you caught it in that video, but there's a moment that made my heart do flip-flops. And it was the moment when Cindy said, "Without Bridget, I don't get to be a mom. I feel like she's the kid I was meant to parent." As a mom, I totally identify with those words. I understand those words, I get why she says them, but more importantly, especially for you mom and dads or grandparents in this room, you feel those words in your soul. Because honestly, there's nothing, absolutely nothing in this world like having a little person love you so deeply. That love that is so pure, it changes you and it makes you a better person. And speaking of boys, I want to introduce you. This is my oldest boy, Derek, and he's totally adorable, right? Of course. Not only does he have glasses, but he has braces. And at school, that's cool right now. It's trendy. When he's 14, probably not, but right now, he's uber popular. But the thing about Derek is that he's one of the kindest kids you'll ever meet because, I'm really not kidding, Derek has a dream. And his dream is to make everyone he meets happy. And I'm starting to see little bits of me through Derek more and more lately. They're starting to come through. And not just because he loves helping others as much as I do, or that I'm told he has my eyes. No, it's because in a few weeks, that baby boy of mine is turning 9. And that's the age I was when my life changed forever, because I was 9 when I became a foster child. As much as I'd like to forget the day I was removed from my home, I can't. And believe me, I've tried. Instead, I remember everything about it. I remember sitting in my 4th grade class reading Where the Red Fern Grows, and thank the Lord we hadn't gotten to the part of what those red ferns represented. I would have lost it. But I remember reading that when the classroom phone rang, and I remember my teacher getting my attention, Shanon, telling me that I was needed in the principal's office. And I remember so clearly the way that my classmates looked at me when she told me, "Make sure you grab your jacket and backpack because you're not coming back." Maybe she meant you're not coming back for the rest of the afternoon, or maybe it meant something else. And when I got to the front office, I knew something was wrong. Because my principal, who was louder than any other man I had ever met before, was so quiet, and he said very little as he led me to my nurse's office. And then what happened next was a total blur of fear and confusion, because waiting for me there wasn't Mrs. Zerbst, the school nurse I had known for years, but a woman I had never seen before. She introduced herself as a CPS worker, and she didn't waste any time in telling me that I wouldn't be going home that day, and that she was taking me to live with a new family instead. When I asked why, she told me it wasn't my fault that I couldn't go home, but that everything was going to be okay. But you know what? There was nothing about that moment that was okay. Because that woman, that stranger danger, was not reassuring me, she was scaring me. And I became even more frightened when I asked her when I could go home, and she said, "I don't know, but not anytime soon." And then she left, because there wasn't a foster home ready for me yet, and she had to go find one. And instead of being taken to a wonderful, magical place like Amara's sanctuary, where a loving adult could care for me, maybe pack me a bag of clothes, and explain what was happening, she had me stay in my nurse's office. And there I stayed, tucked in a corner of the room, all alone, for hours and hours, with nothing to do but ask myself over and over again, what did I do so wrong that my parents didn't want me anymore? And during those hours, my heart broke a million times, because it only took a few hours for me to convince myself that this was all my fault, and that my parents weren't letting me come home because of one simple reason: they stopped loving me. So by the time my CPS worker came back for me, I was done asking questions, except for one. So how am I going to get back to school tomorrow? And her answer ruined me, because she said, "You won't be coming back. You'll start a new school closer to your foster home later this week." And that's when I lost it. I didn't so much cry. It was more like a wail, like the ugly cry we do as adults. Because in a matter of hours, I lost my family and I lost my school. And for a child, without those two things, you lose something so much more important, and that's your sense of belonging. And bless her heart, my school nurse, who watched all of this happen, wasted no time in sitting next to me, pulling me into her arms and hugging me as fiercely as possible. And through my sobs, I heard her say to my CPS worker, "Would it be possible for me to pick Shanon up and take her home every day so she won't have to change schools?" And for a split second, my fear became hope. And that answer changed everything, because in the end, CPS said yes. And Mrs. Zerps became the one person I could rely on, no matter how hard things got for me, as I tried to figure out my new life as a foster child. And my first night in foster care, it was a disaster. My foster family's pet, not a dog, not a cat, not a hamster, a ferret, attacked me. My foster parents' biological daughter went out of her way to ignore me, and I went to bed in the same clothes I'd been wearing since that morning. And getting up was worse, because it was clear that I didn't dream the whole thing, and this nightmare was very real. But it wasn't all that bad, because guess who knocked on the door that morning when it was time for me to go to school? That's right, Mrs. Zerbst. And I swear that was the first time I smiled since getting called to the principal's office the day before. Now, to step back for a moment, I can imagine some of you might be wondering why I was removed from my home in the first place. But quite honestly, I don't think you want to hear that story. And I certainly don't have the strength to tell it. But if there's one thing I want you to understand, even when a child like me has been through the unthinkable, it's this: we don't stop loving our parents. In fact, when we're in foster care, it probably makes us love them even more. And when we're torn from them, it leaves a child like me empty, and you no longer feel whole. And that's why we act out. That's why we act out as foster kids. It's why I acted out. It's not because my foster parents were bad people, quite the opposite. My foster parents were wonderful. Whenever I felt sad, my foster dad would serenade me with "Oh, Shenandoah." And my Spanish foster mom would try her best to make me fried rice because she knew it reminded me of my mom. I acted out because I was hurt, I was scared, and I felt so alone. And because nothing in that house was mine. There weren't pictures of me on the wall. There weren't my paintings on the refrigerator or my favorite cereals in the cupboard. As a foster child, I knew that I was only a guest. And I always wondered when my foster parents, just like me, wouldn't want me anymore and would send me away. That's why my hat goes off and my heart goes out to everyone, especially those who stood today, who becomes a foster parent, because you make it your job to care harder than anyone else. And because you try day in and day out to love children who don't believe they deserve it. I want to say that again. Day in and day out, you try to love a child who does not believe in their heart they deserve it. Because if we were so worthy of love, we think our parents would have tried harder to keep us. Well, that's what I thought anyway. And somewhere along my journey, I began to believe that love wasn't enough. And even more heartbreaking, that I wasn't enough. But then there was Mrs. Zerbst. She was my lifeline to a normal life. And as one person, she gave me the hope that I could trust an adult to always be there for me, because day in and day out, she would show up. And believe me, I'm aware that the gift that she gave me was extraordinary, and her act of kindness is one very few of us could make. But I want to tell you, what was so special about Mrs. Zerbst wasn't her offer to drive me to school and pick me up every day. What made her so special was that she wanted to make a difference. And that's a gift we can all give, to make a difference in a child's life. And you being here today, it's not an accident. You are meant to be here, because somewhere out there, there's a foster child who needs you. A child who is getting shuttled back and forth to therapy appointments and is leaving more confused than encouraged. A child who is trying his best to avoid questions from his friends at school who keep asking him, "Why don't you live with your parents anymore?" And a child who is crying uncontrollably when she's able to visit her mom at a CPS office, only to find out that she's not going home with her that day or any day soon. If there's one thing I want you to know today, it's this: you matter. And somewhere in our community, a child is hoping you'll help. Fortunately, I had people who did help, and because of them, I'm fine. But there are kids in the system right now who aren't fine, and the longer they're in foster care, the harder it becomes for them to be fine. I was lucky to have a foster family, and I was lucky to have Mrs. Zerbst, who told me she would have tried to adopt me in a second if I hadn't been reunified with my mom. And although kids in our community might not have a Mrs. Zerbst or a Cindy, they have Amara, and Amara has you. And you, just like every child in foster care, are more than enough. Thank you.